So what we're here to talk about today, Skylar's going to take us through how to build custom AI tools with fast MCP, how to tame your agents, thinking about debugging and guiding behavior, how to develop scalable agentic workflows, and how to automate real-world tasks. So think about your personal MCP in action. Skylar's had over 10 years building real AI systems at Google, LinkedIn, Mindstrong, Health Rhythms, VP of Engineering and Data Science, scaling AI startups. From startups to global platforms, he's delivered double-digit improvements in core business metrics. This is all the way from FDA-regulated health tech to billion-user recommendation systems. And what I love is a lot of what Skylar tells us about, and what I've learned, is seeing how AI projects fail, seeing how we can use them to transform businesses. And today, Skylar will share exactly what works.
Awesome. Thanks. You may have heard of this thing, MCP, and people are talking about how they're automating their entire lives, their entire businesses with MCP and agents. And there's this story right now that, hey, now that we have MCP, which is basically a unified API that allows AIs to have access to tools and resources. So instead of having custom integrations with each thing you want the AI to access, so like having a custom integration with Slack, custom integration with Google Drive, etc., you have this unified interface. So basically, each thing can integrate, make a model context protocol integration, and then your AI can essentially have one streamlined interface. And so now that we have this interface, and we have lots of off-the-shelf MCPs and tools to use, like AI can actually do stuff. And so AI, surely we would think, can manage a lot of stuff now, right? And you see these posts on Twitter that are like, this one on the right that says, here I'm running 12 to 16 Claude 4 Opus Sonnet code agents, and I'm letting them run for hours at a time with minimal oversight. And then Garrett Scott is saying, we created a to-do list that just does itself. And so we see all these amazing things that people are apparently doing. And then we try to go do something. And we tell Claude, hey, fix this code. And instead of fixing the code, it removes the test. And similar experiences like that. I think a lot of people have had this experience where you see the amazing promise of AI, and then you try to do it yourself, and reality hits. And really, the punchline here right now is that general agents are not generally reliable. There's this really nice benchmark called the Berkeley Function Calling Leaderboard that basically tries to evaluate how well do AIs or various models call the right function at the right time. And the thing I want to call your attention to is first off, this overall accuracy. So nothing has even a single 9, meaning nothing's even 90% accurate. So, a lot of times in reliability, we talk about how many 9s you have. We don't even have 1. And it gets much worse when we get into multi-turn environments, which often when you're trying to automate like complex things, you're probably in a multi-turn environment. There's multiple steps that you got to take. And so this doesn't bode well for us if we're trying to build reliable systems that can do stuff for us. Another 2 things to think about here. One is the hallucination measurement. So even on top of whether or not we're calling the right tool, we still have pretty high hallucination rates across a lot of models. And that's stuff that can mess up whatever workflows you're having in AI do. And lastly, one thing that we don't have great measurement for, I would say, at the moment, or at least I haven't seen one, is what is the uptime and reliability of the AI API providers themselves? My experience working with a lot of clients is very often you have reliability issues. You have latency spiking because the provider's overloaded and other issues. And so all of these kind of compound together into a storm that makes it really challenging to create AI and automation that actually works.
I love that, Skylar. And I just want to add, I just linked to a blog post that I published recently called Stop Building AI Agents. Here's what you should build instead in terms of reliable software. But something we're going to talk about today as well is when you get humans in the loop in the right, like we use agentic stuff all the time. When I use ChatGPT, it has all types of agentic capabilities, such as web search, which I use, but you need a human in the loop in the right way, right?
Totally. And great segue too to this next slide. Omar Khattab, if you don't know him, he's the person behind Colbert and DSPy. Really great person to follow on Twitter, by the way. Has a lot of great stuff to say. But he says this tweet that I really love. He says, "We don't program software because we lack AGI. We program software because we want reliable systems. We already have unreliable general intelligence, 8 billion of us. And reliable systems are about subtracting intelligence in the right places." And this really gets at that idea of having workflows over agents. We want to remove the agentic parts where we don't actually need something to be agentic, because that will make a workflow is going to be more reliable pretty much every time. And so we need to remove the agency parts where we don't actually need it, so that we save our sort of like less reliable parts for only small focused areas. I think on top of that, all the things that make building agents and automating hard, we talked about reliability. Reliability is still a challenge, but also iterations are slow. If you have some big complicated workflow, it's hard to do a very fast iteration because you might have to wait for the AI to do something. And sometimes these LLM APIs are slow relative to local code or maybe some other like faster APIs you may have used. We often don't know what's happening on the inside. And so when the AI doesn't work, it's very easy to just give up because you're like, I don't know what the heck's going on. And it's very easy to get a complex system. Again, there's a lot going on, a lot of different tools we can add, especially when we're using MCP. And then again, everything's unreliable. And so today I just want to walk through some of the principles that I tend to follow when I'm building AI systems. And these are pretty much the exact things I teach to my clients. The first thing is you always want to create a fast dev loop. It should be really fast for you to make changes and then as instantly as possible see them. You want to make sure you have strong observability from the start so that you can track and understand what's going on. You want to break everything down into real small composable bits. So this is basically talking about, instead of going full agent to start, try to break down your problem into smaller pieces. Start with small, simple tools, maybe a tool that just gets an email to start. And then your next tool might be, okay, let me get an email and draft a reply to it. And you can start composing these into workflows. And then you can give those workflows to agents as tools themselves. And so instead of an agent having to figure out how to string together 10 tools, you might have a workflow that is a tool the agent can use that does something that is more useful than what a single tool might do on its own. I'll touch on something with agentic coding, although that's not like a big focus in this. And then there'll be a lot of slides on different reliability techniques, on ways we can take something that's fundamentally unreliable, this LLM, and things we can do to help make it more reliable for our use cases. The rest of this talk will basically, I'm going to show a little demo of a couple of automations I have in a weekly review I do. And then I'll basically just go through those principles. I'll show you how I implement them and give you example code and show you how it works. So let's just get started with kind of the examples. So I have this full weekly review where I go in and I look at everything across my personal life and my business. So it involves like making sure I'm up to date on my emails, making sure all my projects are up to date, and I'm like updating my tracking of tasks, looking at finances, looking at metrics and analytics. So a lot of stuff. It would take too long for me to run the whole thing because there's way too many steps. So I'm just going to pull 2 steps out of this and just show you what it can look like. So the first one is basically I have a little flow where I archive emails I don't need to respond to and then draft replies to emails I need to respond to. And then I get analytics from LinkedIn. And so we're just going to jump in and I'm just going to show you what this looks like. So first thing I need to do is set up my little browser use thing. But basically, and we'll see if the demo gods are with me today.
Beautiful.
So cool. So first I'm just going to spin up the MCP server that I have. And then I'm going to basically run a command against that MCP server that runs my weekly review.
And as stated, everyone, we'll send through all relevant code after the lesson.
Yeah. So I'll just show my terminal here. We'll get to and I'll explain what's going on in some of these logs. But basically, while it's running, I'll talk a little bit about this. But generally, like, I don't want to lose an email that I need to respond to and that it might think is not relevant. So basically, I have this thing where you can see this attempt 1 of 2 for human approval of wrapper. And so basically, I force it to categorize every email as either needs a reply or we can archive it. And then it has to get human approval from me. And I can give real, real text feedback and reject it. And if I reject it, it will be fed back into the AI so that it can correct its predictions. And so you can see it's waiting for approval. And so I use this great service called Human Layer. Highly recommend you check it out. But I basically have this dashboard now, and you can see that I have all of the information. Here's an email I have about, if you're familiar with Hamel and Shreya's evals course, I'm signed up for that. So there's an email from that. Here's like a newsletter thing. Here's actually an email from Hugo about building LLM applications being featured in the Maven Top 100. And so a lot of stuff here. And so we can see that there's like a bunch of reasons provided. So I force it to give a reason why. And it gives a classification on whether we need to archive it or draft a reply. Just for the purposes of, I think looking at these are all truly things that I would just archive because none of them are things I would reply to. They're just like newsletter things pushed out. But just so you can see a draft reply, I'll go ahead and accept this one.
And Deep has asked the question, is it possible to run this as a complete background agent? I presume that means where it just like runs once a week or something along those lines. And
totally. Yeah. So if I just ran a command. So if you just threw that into a scheduler like cron or something, it could just keep running. There is a human in the loop aspect to this. So before it takes any more action, it's going to wait for me to approve. There are lots of different architectures you can do where you could do an async workflow where you have a webhook that human layer hits, if the approval might take a very long time and you're not like doing it in real time. Or if you are comfortable removing the human in the loop, you could just remove that part and then just have it run and just do its thing. But again, there are risks to that. And so you have to make sure you're comfortable with that risk. So I'm going to go ahead and approve that. So I can see it's marked approved. And then if we go back into here, we see it's doing some stuff here. And I'm just going to open this because the other thing it's going to do is basically this is all browser use. Look, Ma, no hands. And it's navigating to LinkedIn to then collect my analytics from this page. So I didn't touch that. That was all the bot you saw that navigated to LinkedIn. And so now when we come back over here, we can see that it dumped out my analytics. So number of followers, 3,603. And we can check that that's right. And so it just pulled out a bunch of these analytics from there. And so that's like an example of a browser use. And notice I had it do something really simple, but useful. Like most of these social platforms locked down. I want to get my analytics very easily. I don't have to go to each and every platform. So I have a little small browser use agent for each of these platforms that I monitor to go and fetch my analytics so I can put them in a consistent place. The other thing I wanted to just like briefly hit is we had this drafted email. So let's check to see where that drafted email is. And so this is where it was drafted. And this is, if you folks are familiar with the MLOps community, they sent a quick thing to me. And so this drafted a response to it. Hi, Demetrios. Thanks for the info about the virtual conference. I'm excited to see the topics. I'm considering submitting a talk. Would love to discuss ideas. Can we have a time to chat this week? And so that was all done by this AI. Now I can go and edit it if I want. I can say, hey, actually, I don't need to draft a response. Let me delete it. So that's something that saves me a lot of time week to week. Again, those are just two small examples. I have a much more complete week review that I do. It's hard to extract that out and give it as code because it has a lot of personal information into it. So I had to extract out a couple that were easier to show. But again, for folks asking about where can we customize our prompts in this workflow, there'll be code given, as Hugo said, and I'm going to walk through some code and you'll see the bits where you can like actually specify your prompt. But yeah, I'll pause there for a second just to see if there are any questions about the demo itself. So just to quickly talk about some of the tools that are used to build this. One is fast MCP. That's how I implement the MCP servers. You can also basically use fast MCP to proxy other existing MCP servers. And that way you can use off the shelf stuff. For all of the AI functionality, I use Miroscope. If you have questions about Miroscope, I think Will Bax, the CEO of Miroscope, might be here. And then LilyPad, also from Miroscope, is how I log everything. And so I have a place to go see the logs for everything. And then Human Layer for approvals. So if you want to get a fast dev loop, I think the basic thing is you really want to make sure you have hot reloading, and you want to make sure that you can basically easily just call a tool on your MCP server. And so basically the things I recommend when you're running your server, you want to run it with, instead of using that fast MCP tool like the documentation recommends, you actually want to run it directly through Uvicorn. So I have a command up there. Don't worry, all of this code that you're seeing on screen is in the repo that we'll send you at the end. So don't feel like you need to take notes or anything. But yeah, so that reload basically makes it hot reload. So anytime you make a change, boom, your server is updated. And so it gets you into faster dev loops. And then also I have something that allows you to call tools from the same script. And you saw me do that when I ran the weekly review. And that way you can pretty easily call a tool. The next thing is you really want to have strong observability. And this is something that a lot of people put off and say, hey, I'll do it later. This is something I think you should do day zero. And so I like LilyPad because of two things. One, very simple interface, just a decorator you can slap on top of your function, and then everything's traced. It will automatically capture LLM stuff. But on top of that, it automatically versions your code too. And so that way, when you're looking at logs, you can see how your function changed over time. The second thing that's related to observability, I really like using IPDB. It's a Python debugger. So with that hot reload, if I'm seeing an error or something, I can just go ahead and drop this import IPDB, set a trace, and then I can start debugging and get a little window like this that you see at the bottom. Composition, this is something I think is missing from a lot of the rhetoric and content around MCP. It's cool that you can make a tool. I want to compose tools together to make workflows, and I want my agents to also be exposed as tools. Really, you need a way to be able to compose things. This shows a simple example of composition where there's two tools, add, square, and then I have this sum of squares, which uses the add and square tools. You'll notice that it's a little clunky to use, and this is because MCP currently doesn't have the notion of a schema for the output, and so you kind of have to parse it yourself. But definitely like use this kind of approach. Make small things and then tools call other tools. So I'll get to the questions that I'm seeing in the chat later, given time constraints. The last thing on going fast that I would say is basically you can take this MCP server and install it in your agentic coder and give your like Claude or whatever access to it. And I think at this point, if you are coding and you're not using an agentic like coding assistant, probably you're not going as fast as you could. And so highly recommend you do that. Install your personal MCP server, and then you can start calling things from Claude. So this is an example where I called that sum of squares function through Claude Code because it had the MCP server installed. Now I just want to jump into the meat of how do you make agents reliable? And so first, just want to talk a little bit about what an agent in Miroscope kind of looks like, especially one that uses MCP. So this is an example of using that sum of squares MCP server that I showed before. We can define this LLM function through Miroscope with this decorator at llm.call. And basically, we're just telling it, hey, use this model. And basically, the function you define is going to define the prompt. And so you can see I'm returning these messages. So I'm returning a system message and then the user query. And then I pass in this history of messages because the agent's going to do some stuff. And we want it to, for each call, to basically keep track of the history. And so then we have some code here that's basically just doing one step, where each step can either be the final output or the agent might choose to call a tool. And so this run agent one step, all that's doing is like parsing out like, hey, did we want to call a tool? If so, let's call that tool and pass it back to the agent. And then we can have this run agent function that basically sets everything up. So because we're using MCP, we have this async with SSE client, and that's really just connecting to our MCP server. And then we're listing the tools. And then we apply some kind of tool filter because, again, remember the function calling leaderboard. The reality is the more tools you give to an agent, the more likely it is to use the wrong one. And so you only want to give it access to the tools that it's going to need to do its focused objective. And so we have a little filter here, and then we just keep looping until either we hit a maximum number of steps, which is usually a good idea so that you don't run forever, or we get to the answer. And this basically gives you an agent that you can run. And again, this code is in the repo. Because we have 1 minute left, I think like all of the reliability stuff here, I think this is stuff folks can go through at their leisure. And you can always like at me on Twitter or LinkedIn, and happy to answer questions. And you can find all of these have examples and all of the codes available, but would love to just pass this over to Hugo, talk a little bit about the course.
Yeah, all I want to say about the course before we get to questions, and of course we'll share all the code afterwards, is that this is a course we've taught twice already called Building LLM Applications for Data Scientists and Software Engineers. And it is for data scientists, machine learning engineers, and AI engineers who want to learn a lot more about this stuff and really how to go from prototype to production. The entire software development lifecycle in evaluation, and really evaluation-driven development. And I'll send a few more resources after the fact. But it goes for a month. It's 8 2-hour sessions throughout the month, plus weekly building clubs on top of that. We have a lot of guest speakers. Last time we had people like Swix and Hamel Hussein and Ines Montani from Spacey and Philip Carter from Honeycomb. I hope to get Skylar to join this time to talk more about all the wonderful things he's doing with MPC and what he's seeing out there in the field. We have a private Discord channel for discussion, and the community there is great. We also provide $500 in cloud credits from Modal, 300 credits in cloud compute from Google, and we're in the process of just securing a few more sponsorships. Without further ado, perhaps Skylar, we want to get to a few questions and then we can wrap up in a few minutes.
Totally, yeah. The first question I see that we didn't get to, Deep asked about running this as a background agent, and he said, in the sense that the agent doesn't ask for any feedback, it's self-learning, like it reads your inbox and understands which one it should archive. You could totally do that. This is a more complicated thing. My suggestion, if you want something like that, first of all, you can create a data set of like emails that you have archived just by querying for a list of emails that don't have the inbox tag. And then you can also like get a list of emails that you've responded to and like how you've responded. So that's pretty easy. And you can then start to iterate on a prompt, basically, or an agent that takes certain actions and basically set up some kind of eval harness so you know how good you're doing. But yeah, you could totally remove the human in the loop. You just want to make sure you get it to a level of reliability that you're comfortable with. Like how risky is it or how bad is it for you to like accidentally archive an email you should reply to, or accidentally draft a reply that you should archive? Can it be modified for LinkedIn engagement, like auto-commenting? Yes, again. So this is a case browser use. You can do lots of things with it. You could auto-comment. That's just a much harder thing to do. Like the first thing you have to solve is what are you commenting on and how is it like navigating to that thing? That's probably going to be the harder part. That's a little bit trickier, but you totally can. You should also be very careful about the level of automation you use on a lot of these websites, because most of these large platforms have anti-abuse teams that will ban you if you're doing too much that is detected. Where can we customize prompts in this workflow? That'll be in the GitHub repo. And what more can we do with this? MCP gives you a lot of leeway. You can basically do almost anything now, as long as you write your own MCP for it. And so pretty much everything is out there for you to do. There are a lot of platforms that try to lock themselves off because they don't want you to get their data. And that's where you might experience some friction. What's my opinion on MCP? Are they reliable to be used in prod applications? I would say probably maybe not at the moment. I think there's some critical things missing that have recently been addressed. The biggest problem is with authentication. You can get around that by putting everything into a private subnet. But I think the biggest issues with MCP right now are security ones. And so I think once we get a better story around authentication, then I think it'll be like more production ready. Somebody asked what MCP protocol I was using here, STDIO or OAuth. OAuth isn't one of the protocols. There are 3 today: STDIO, server-side events, and then HTTP. Server-side events was what I was using, but that's now considered legacy and it's deprecated. That's just what I've been familiar with, since that was what was available to do remote calls before. Tools should call their tools. Why do you want to compose them? That can lead to code bloat and redundancy. I think software engineering has always been about composition. And so that might be just a place where you have a difference of opinion. If you're not composing, that means you're rewriting everything from scratch.
And I think composability is one of the things I love about the space now. And if you go back to, let's bring back Unix vibes as well. Pipe operators, dude. Like that's what we're doing. It's plumbing, right?
Yep.
And in fact, it's what the data flow paradigm is all about. And although LinkedIn, or as I like to call it, TikTok for adults, is focused on models all the time, we are still intrinsically, this is data science. So we still very much are doing things with the data flow paradigm, whether we're focused on the models or not.
Totally.
Amazing questions. Thank you all for joining. But most of all, Skylar, thank you for being out there on the front line, dealing with all the wild stuff out there, and for bringing back your wisdom, man.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. It was fun.
Cool. Such a pleasure. All right. See you soon, everyone.